Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a professor in an information science department, and this video is about money. So I'm going to go ahead and spoil the end of this video by giving you an answer to the question in the title, which is, how much does a PhD cost? Or rather, how much should a PhD cost? The simplistic answer is nothing. It should cost you $0. That said, it is much more complicated than that, so watch on. If you're curious about this, it's possibly because you're considering getting a PhD, but I even find that current PhD students sometimes don't have a good understanding of where their funding is coming from. And in both cases, you will find that this is highly variable by discipline, institution, department, sometimes even who your PhD advisor is. Now, my experience is mostly with STEM fields in the United States, mostly computer science, though I also asked on social media for people to give me lots of different kinds of models for this to make sure that I had a broader sense of it. I've also decided that I'm really going to talk about this in terms of the United States because I still don't have a really good grasp of what the models are like in other countries, though I will see that there are some similarities. I want to start with a note as well that as a PhD student, you shouldn't have to have any kind of anxiety about where your funding is coming from, particularly if it's guaranteed for a certain number of years. But the way that these things shake out are just different for different students, and nothing is better or worse than another. I always tell my students that it is my job to try to find money, not theirs. If you feel like this is just going to give you anxiety, skip this video. So first of all, many, maybe most PhDs, particularly in STEM fields, are fully funded. What this means is that you are not paying directly for your PhD. This actually means that not only are you not paying tuition, but you're also getting a stipend for living expenses. If this is not the case for a PhD program that you're considering, I think that you should think very hard about whether you want to do that. A PhD is a long time, and it's also a lot of work. So if you are paying for tuition and likely taking out student loans for that, and you're also not getting a stipend, that means that either you're working full time while getting a PhD, which is very, very challenging, or you're taking out massive amounts of student loans. We're talking loans on par with medical school or law school, but without the doctor or lawyer salary when you're done with it. In any case, we're going to be talking here about PhDs that are funded, but where does that money come from and what are you doing for it? The large percentage of the time, it's not just the department or the university paying for you to be a PhD student out of the kindness of their hearts. So there are a few most common funding sources, particularly the first two, so let me go through those. First, you teach, either as a teaching assistant or sometimes eventually teaching your own class as the instructor. So this means that when you get a stipend, it's essentially your salary for teaching undergrads. And this is necessary and important and also really good experience. Even if you don't plan to go into academia, learning how to be a good teacher is a really good skill to have. In most humanities disciplines and some social sciences as well, and some other places, almost all, if not all, of your funding comes from. In my college, for example, other departments besides mine, media studies, communication, PhD students teach through their entire PhD. In my department, information science, which is structured a lot like computer science, students teach for some of the time, but not all of the time. So this is a really common model in STEM fields that your funding is a combination of teaching assistantships and research assistantships. So that's the second funding source, research grants. If you are a research assistant, this means that your stipend is essentially your salary for being a researcher on a particular funded project. Now, I could do a whole video about grant budgets and where the money goes and what you budget for when you, for example, beg the National Science Foundation for money. But unless you're in some field where you're having to buy really expensive equipment, the vast majority of the money goes towards graduate students. So first, there's that stipend, and the amount of the stipend varies by institution a lot and often by individual program or department. I tend to hear them typically being between like $22,000 and $28,000 a year. Again, it's not a lot. It's enough to live on most of the time, but it's not a lot. There's also tuition, which is a cost, even though the student doesn't typically see it. You might not even know how much your tuition is. There's also money for benefits, things like health insurance. And at my university, in a budget for a grant, all of these things together, not even counting overhead, one PhD student costs about $50,000 per academic year. Anyway, hundreds of thousands of dollars of a grant actually doesn't go very far, which is the topic of a whole nother video. Here's a really important thing about research assistant funding that I'm not sure all students realize. And this is that most of the time, grant funding is tied to a specific faculty member. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to this. Sometimes there are research funds baked into like centers or whatever. But most of the time, individual faculty members are applying for grant funding for specific research projects that then their PhD advisees will carry out. Now, in my discipline and most STEM fields, from what I'm seeing from the responses on Twitter, for example, most PhDs are funded as a combination of teaching assistantships and research assistantships. This means that some of the funding comes from the department or the university, and some of it comes from individual faculty members' grant funding. So unlike the humanities, like I mentioned, most of the time you're not teaching the whole time, but are a research assistant for some of the time. Another thing is that different types of grant funding are more or less rigid in terms of the work that has to be done and the deliverables out of it. For example, some military funding is very rigid in terms of exactly what has to be done, whereas National Science Foundation funding, for example, you can deviate a bit from the project that you propose as long as it's in the same general wheelhouse. So for example, some of my grant funding is to study research ethics for computer scientists. One of my current PhD advisees is very interested in Black Twitter and is doing a related project about Black Twitter that might eventually become part of her dissertation. So she was funded under this grant for the summer, and she did a project about research ethics for people studying Black Twitter. Black Twitter was never mentioned in my grant proposal, but it's in the same general area, and so she's able to do some work that is related to the kinds of things that she's interested in, even though I had this grant money far before she showed up in my lab. So another nuance of this is whether your RA-ship is paying you to do research that is related at all to your dissertation or even things that you are interested in. One way to think about this is that as a PhD student, you have several jobs. One is coursework, and typically you're done with coursework within 2 or 3 years. Another is whatever you're doing as your job that you're getting paid for your stipend. So this might be, again, teaching, or it might be research. And then your third job is your own research, eventually what will be your dissertation. So the dream, and what would be the ideal if money grew on trees, is that when a student has a research assistantship, it is paying them to do the research that they would be doing anyway for their dissertation. This is actually a really privileged position to be in, and not everyone has this luxury. Sometimes even if you have a research assistantship, it's to do work that's unrelated to your dissertation, so it becomes extra work. For example, 1 year of my PhD, I was funded on a grant where I did research related to improv comedy. Ask me about that sometime. Unfortunately, this perfect research match is increasingly hard as grant money is harder to get. And of course, there's also some topics of research that are just difficult to find funding for, and that does not mean that you shouldn't do them. But in the end, the truth is that, again, it's just not fair, and there's going to be some inequity among students. And this might just mean that your experience is slightly different, that it takes you longer to graduate, all kinds of things. And this is one of the things that I meant when I brought up in my video about advice for PhD students to not compare yourself to other people. One thing that happens when students are fortunate enough to have funding for their own research that they're passionate about is that they may be far more research productive than you can be because you're spending 20 hours a week teaching and then also doing your research instead of having all of that time to do your research. And it's just how things are. And it's often the case that you're just not going to know, even when you're going in and deciding which PhD program to go into, how this is going to shake out for you. But I would say in general, just be prepared to know that like about half your time as a PhD student, you're going to be spending doing something to earn your stipend. And that's fine. This is how it is for most PhD students. But trust me, it beats having to pay tuition and take out a ton of student loans. Plus, anything that you are doing to earn that stipend is a really good experience for you. Teaching is actually an awesome experience. In fact, a lot of people would rather teach during their entire PhD than be a research assistant, particularly if that research is unrelated to their dissertation. So I actually might encourage you to ask about teaching opportunities, particularly to be the instructor of your own class. Sometimes those even pay a little bit more than being a teaching assistant. Okay, so those are the two major sources of funding for PhD students. However, there are some other ones. For example, fellowships, both internal and external. Fellowship is basically we are paying for you to be a PhD student. Sometimes it's tied to a particular research project that you're doing, and sometimes it's not. But this money is to the student, not to the faculty advisor. Some departments, for example, have money available to fund, say, all of their PhD students for their first year, or all of their PhD students for their last year. Or sometimes they have competitive fellowships where there's a line in the department for a student for a year or two or their whole time or whatever. Sometimes there are also university level fellowships. Often these are applied for by the department when someone is admitted, kind of on your behalf. There are also a number of external fellowships that PhD students can apply to. For example, the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program, GRFP. For this, the student writes the application themselves, and if it is funded, then they get money directly from the NSF to do whatever project they propose doing. There are also fellowships from private companies, for example, Microsoft and Google, where you apply stating a specific research project. And also keep in mind that these external fellowships are extremely competitive. Most of you will never get one. I didn't. And then, of course, there are a range of other possibilities that I just know less about or are less common. For example, some countries' governments will pay for someone to get a PhD abroad. Sometimes companies will pay for an employee to get a PhD. Sometimes you keep working at that company while you're doing your PhD part-time and they'll pay your tuition, and then you don't, also do a research or teaching assistantship because you don't need the stipend because you still have your salary. There are also other potential costs and other potential benefits to consider. For example, a lot of universities have fees that you have to pay, and these fees aren't part of your tuition, so therefore they don't go under the tuition waiver, and so you have to pay them out of pocket. Sometimes you have to pay for health insurance out of pocket, and sometimes not. Also, as a PhD student, you may have funds available to you for things like conference travel or research expenses. And again, how this works really varies. Sometimes departments have money for student travel that they pay for. Sometimes your advisor pays for your conference travel out of research grants. Again, it just varies. In fact, all of this varies a lot. And so let me tell you now the kinds of questions that I think would be good for you to ask when you're trying to figure out how this works for a particular PhD program. Some of these questions you might ask, for example, of the program director. If you're at a site visit or an open house and there's a information session, you can raise your hand and answer this question because then everyone else will also know the answer. Some of these might be appropriate to ask your prospective advisor, and a lot of them you could probably get the answers from current students in the program. So the big one Is funding guaranteed for PhD students, and if so, for how many years? I've heard that this varies a lot. Typically, I hear 4 to 5 years. Sometimes I even hear, oh, it's not guaranteed, but we just know that they're all going to get it. For what it's worth, in my department, and I've seen this in some other places as well, the funding guarantee is for 4 years. That's what it says in the offer letter. However, there is an understanding that if you're around for longer than that, you will still have funding. Sometimes the reason that the guarantee might be less than what it is in practice is because, again, it's on paper, it's contractual, and so there has to be money sort of in the bank to cover that. So then the next question you should ask is, do the students in your program tend to take longer than that? And if so, is it funded? A related question to ask is whether students are guaranteed summer funding or not. And if so, what the sources of that summer funding is. And then you might also ask, if not, do most students have summer funding? So for example, in my department, summer funding is not guaranteed on paper. However, in practice, a large number of our students go get external internships, which means that there is funding available for the students who don't through summer teaching and through summer research assistant lines. In fact, in terms of finance-related questions, you might go ahead and ask where students tend to get internships. Because another thing about funding as a PhD student is if you get an internship working, for example, at a big tech company for the summer, you make a lot of money over the summer that you can then use to supplement your income throughout the rest of the year. So the next question is, what are the sources of funding in general? Teaching, research assistantships, a combination, etc. And again, some departments might have everyone is funded through a fellowship their first year or something like that, and that would be really good to know. That's actually a really nice bonus. You might also ask what the typical proportion of teaching versus research students tend to be funded on. However, there might not be an answer to that at the department level. It might vary by individual advisor. Also, you might ask directly if there are department or university level fellowships, and if so, how those are awarded. Another thing to ask, do PhD students have access to funds for conference travel? And if so, how much or how are those awarded, etc. You should ask whether there are going to be out-of-pocket costs, for example, for health insurance or fees, and how much that tends to be. Again, this is also something that you could ask a current student and they could tell you. And of course, how much is the stipend? And you should consider these relative to cost of living. For example, $25,000 a year looks a lot different in San Francisco than it does in Indiana. And this is something, again, that I think you can get a really good sense of from current students. Now, there's a lot more to consider on where you should go to a PhD program than how much money you're putting out or making or whatever. This would just be part of it. And so I do feel like I need to note it is possible to take out student loans as a PhD student if you need them to, for example, supplement your living expenses, particularly if you have a family. This isn't ideal, of course, and I feel like it's a totally personal decision. For what it's worth, I'm still paying off my student loans from law school, and it hasn't ruined my life. So if you have to borrow a little bit of money so that you can be slightly more comfortable as you're finishing up your PhD, I don't think that it's the end of the world. But again, very personal decision. And I'll also note something here that I mentioned in my Should You Get a PhD video, which is that even though you're not paying for a PhD in a literal sense and that you're not giving someone tuition money, there are very clear opportunity costs. For the 5 years or so that you're getting a PhD, you are making very little money with that stipend. This means that, for example, you might not be saving for retirement that whole time. This is why I'm going to be working until I'm 80. So just make sure that you really want it, because you don't go into a PhD for the money. So I'm sure that I did not cover all of the nuances of this topic. And again, this was quite US specific. In Europe, for example, PhDs are much less time, often 3 years. Sometimes you don't have coursework at all because you did that as part of a prior graduate degree. But I've heard similar things about money coming from a sort of combination of specific grant-funded projects and teaching, etc. What I hope is that I gave you a place to start thinking about this and maybe the right kinds of questions to ask to find out more. Because Again, for the people in the back, this is highly variable. Often a really good place to start, though, is talking to students who are in current PhD programs because they can tell you what their finances look like. So I might not be able to answer very specific questions on this topic, but I will do my best if you leave questions in the comments. Also, if you are a current student or faculty member, feel free to leave some information about what the funding model is for your program. And all of this, again, is just one thing that you should consider in deciding where to accept an offer of admission into a PhD program. So please stay tuned because I will be doing another video about all of the other things that you should be taking into account. All right. My best wishes to all of you. I hope that all of your funding dreams come true. I'm Casey. Thanks for watching.